Okay, so um, thinking about starting a family, right? Maybe you've seen those brochures from overseas clinics, the ones that promise like almost guaranteed healthy babies through third generation IVF. It's tempting for sure, especially when you deal with all the anxieties of infertility, right?
Yeah.
But before you book that flight, I think we need to do a little deep dive here into this world of third generation IVF.
Yeah.
Really unpack what's going on.
Yeah.
Beyond the promises.
Yeah, we've got tons of research and legal cases to go through.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting, the difference between like the marketing we see overseas and how strict things are here in Singapore.
Yeah.
That right there is a red flag for me.
Yeah. Okay. So third generation IVF.
Right.
We're talking about pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidies, or PGT-A as it's called. Sometimes it's called pre-implantation genetic screening, or PGS.
Yep.
But it's basically screening embryos for genetic abnormalities.
Right, like Down syndrome.
Right, things like that.
Yeah.
Before they're implanted.
It's supposed to increase your chances of having a healthy pregnancy.
Right.
But if you look closer at the research, there's this pattern of marketing that, kind of preys on those anxieties.
Yeah.
And uses like skewed statistics to make things seem riskier than they are.
What do you mean by skewed statistics?
Well, they focus on relative risk.
Okay.
So they might say something like your risk of Down syndrome goes up like tenfold in your late 30s.
Right.
Which is technically true, but it doesn't tell the whole story.
Okay.
It's like saying your chances of winning the lottery increase 10 times if you buy 2 tickets instead of 1.
Yeah.
Like, technically your relative risk is higher, but your overall chances are still tiny.
So it makes the risk seem bigger than it really is.
Exactly. And it's not just about fear-mongering. Some clinics subtly offer gender selection, too.
Really?
As like an added bonus.
Wow.
Even though it's ethically and legally complex,
Right. So you've got anxieties, and then you've got these marketing tactics, and on top of that, the chance to choose your baby's gender. It's no wonder people are interested in third generation IVF.
Right.
But then there's Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
They're super cautious.
Right.
So what's the deal there?
Well, unlike a lot of countries that have embraced third generation IVF, Singapore has these really strict regulations.
Okay.
It's not just available to everyone, and it's mostly limited to clinical trials in government hospitals. You have to meet specific criteria.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah.
And it's not just Singapore who's worried. The UK's Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, or HFEA, they gave third generation IVF a red light rating.
Right.
What's that about?
They were worried about misdiagnosis and the lack of evidence that it actually improves pregnancy rates.
So they're saying the technology isn't as reliable as some clinics claim?
Yeah.
We also looked into what the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, or ASRM, had to say.
Yeah.
What did they find?
It was pretty surprising, actually. They basically said that third generation IVF doesn't guarantee higher pregnancy rates, and they're not even sure if it reduces miscarriages.
So the marketing doesn't match the reality?
Right.
But even if the testing was accurate, are there any risks with the procedure itself?
Oh, absolutely. This is where things get interesting. To do the genetic testing, they have to take cells from the embryo. It's called a biopsy.
Yeah.
And this can damage the embryo and mess with its development.
So even with accurate testing, you could still harm the embryo by getting the information.
Yeah, and there's more. A lot of the research that says genetic testing is safe uses high-quality embryos.
Okay.
But what about the lower quality embryos?
Yeah.
Which are more common in older women. Those embryos are way more fragile.
Right.
So they're more likely to get damaged during the biopsy.
So the women who are most drawn to third generation IVF because they're worried about abnormalities
Exactly.
could actually be putting their embryos at greater risk.
Yeah, it's kind of a paradox.
And then you have those mosaic embryos.
Right.
The ones with a mix of normal and abnormal cells.
Exactly.
So not clearly healthy or unhealthy.
Yeah. And the research suggests that these mosaic embryos can actually fix themselves
Oh, wow.
during development
Okay.
and lead to totally healthy births.
So tossing them out based on a genetic test could be a mistake.
Yeah, particularly for older women who often have fewer embryos to work with.
Right.
Getting rid of a potentially good embryo really lowers their chances.
So we've got potential harm from the biopsy uncertainty about these mosaic embryos and marketing promises that don't match the science.
Right.
And it's not just theoretical. There are real legal cases.
Yeah, that's right.
You mentioned those before.
There are class action lawsuits happening right now in the U.S. against some of the biggest genetic testing companies involved in third generation IVF.
Really?
Like Cooper Genomics, Inc., Cooper Surgical, Inc., the Cooper Companies, Inc. Reproductive Genetic Innovations, LLC, Progenesis Inc., and Natera Inc.
Wow, those are big names. What are they being accused of?
It's serious stuff like fraud and harming patients.
So this isn't just hypothetical. People are actually getting hurt.
Exactly. And there's this case in Australia that really highlights the issue.
Okay.
Monash IVF, a fertility clinic there, ended up settling a lawsuit for 56 million Australian dollars.
56 million. That's huge. Why? What happened?
There were misdiagnoses during third-generation IVF. Healthy embryos were destroyed because the test results were wrong.
Oh, wow.
It took away those couples' chance to have a child.
That's awful.
No.
So the desire for this perfect embryo is leading to the destruction of healthy ones.
It's complicated. You know, there aren't easy answers.
Yeah.
But before we get into the ethical and emotional side of things, let's take a second to absorb all this.
Yeah.
We'll be back in a bit to keep going with our deep dive into third-generation IVF.
Okay, so welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We've been talking about some pretty concerning stuff with third-generation IVF.
Yeah.
Misleading marketing, potential misdiagnoses, even harm to embryos.
It's a lot to take in, and I think it shows why it's so important to look past the marketing and really understand the science, the risks, all of it.
Yeah, for sure. I can see why couples dealing with infertility would want something that promises to make things easier.
Of course. That's a totally understandable desire. But the problem is the science isn't really there yet.
Right. And that makes me think about how careful Singapore is being.
Uh-huh.
Those strict regulations make it seem like they're not convinced the benefits outweigh the risks.
Right. It's like they're saying, wait a minute, let's figure this out before we offer it to everyone.
Yeah. So if third-generation IVF isn't the answer, what other options are there for couples who are worried about genetic conditions?
That's a good question. I think we need to shift away from just trying to screen out everything and focus on supporting healthy pregnancies from the start.
Okay, I like that. So what would that look like?
Well, there's non-invasive prenatal testing, or NIPT.
Right.
It's a blood test you can do during pregnancy that can screen for certain genetic conditions.
Yeah, I've heard of that. It's getting more accurate all the time, right?
Yeah, the technology's come a long way.
So instead of doing a biopsy and potentially harming the embryo, you could just get information about the fetus's health during the pregnancy.
Right.
With way less risk.
Exactly. And if there are any concerns, you can always talk to a genetic counselor.
Okay.
They can give families personalized advice and support.
It seems like a much better approach overall.
It is. And you don't have to throw away potentially healthy embryos because of a genetic test.
Right, like those mosaic embryos.
Exactly. The ones that could self-correct and lead to healthy babies.
Right.
With NIPT and genetic counseling, you could just watch those pregnancies more closely and make decisions based on what you see.
Makes sense. So it's all about having the right information when you need it.
Yeah, and making choices that feel right for you and your situation.
And that brings us back to why it's so important to do your research and talk to experts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can't just believe the marketing. You have to dig deeper and ask questions.
Right. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Exactly.
And we should talk about the emotional side of things too. Choosing to do third-generation IVF or any kind of genetic testing can be really stressful.
It can. And it's okay to admit that you're scared of having a child with a genetic condition.
Yeah.
The fear is valid.
But it's also important to remember that having a child with a disability isn't a failure.
Definitely not. It's just a different kind of journey. And there's so much love and support out there for families who choose that path.
That's a good point. What we're trying to do here is just encourage people to think about all sides of this issue.
Uh-huh.
It's not about saying third-generation IVF is bad or telling people what to do. It's about giving them the information they need to make the best choice for themselves.
Right. And it's about understanding that there's no one right way to build a family.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. The science, the marketing, the ethics, the emotional stuff.
It's a lot.
But the biggest takeaway is informed decision-making.
Right.
Do your research, talk to experts, and trust your gut.
And remember, there are other options. NIPT and genetic counseling can give you a lot of information and support without the risks of a third-generation IVF.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation.
Yeah.
And I'm sure our listeners are thinking about all this.
Mm-hmm.
But before we go, we want to leave you with a question. Given everything we've talked about, how do you see the future of family planning? What role will these technologies play in the families of tomorrow? Okay, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive on third-generation IVF. It's been a lot to process all this information.
Yeah, there are so many layers to this.
We've talked about the science, the risks, the ethics, the emotional side of it all.
Uh-huh.
But there's one more thing I think we need to consider.
Okay.
The long-term effects. Not just for the parents,
Right.
but for the kids who were born using these technologies.
That's an important point that often gets missed in all the excitement about new technology. What does it mean for a child to know they were chosen based on their genes?
It's almost like a new kind of pressure.
Yeah.
Imagine growing up knowing your parents picked you because you had certain genes.
Right.
Does that make you feel like you have to live up to some expectation?
It's a really interesting question, and honestly, we don't have the answers yet.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something we need to be thinking about as this technology becomes more common.
And what about the other side of that? The embryos that weren't good enough.
Right.
Do parents feel a sense of loss for those potential children?
Absolutely. It's a unique kind of grief.
Yeah.
You're mourning a possibility, a child that could have been.
It makes me wonder if in our search for the perfect baby, we're forgetting something important.
What's that?
That every child is special and valuable, no matter their genes.
I think that's so important. Our society puts so much pressure on us to be perfect, to optimize everything, even our kids.
Right.
But what about accepting the unexpected? The things that make us human?
Being a parent isn't about control.
Right.
It's about letting go and accepting the journey as it comes.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And that's what I hope people take away from this deep dive.
The importance of making informed choices, of course, but also having compassion for yourself and for all the difficult choices ahead.
So to wrap things up, we just want to encourage you to keep asking those hard questions. Don't just accept what you hear. Challenge the assumptions. And remember, there's no right answer when it comes to starting a family.
That's right.
A personal journey. And the most important thing is to make choices that align with your values, your situation, and your heart. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.